Hello again, fellow Mystery Files. Today I rank my top 10 murderers from Ngaio Marsh novels starring Inspector Roderick Alleyn of Scotland Yard. And my approach to this list is very similar to the way I approach the Christie murderers. I am taking into account the murder plot, how evil and ruthless they are, and how good of a murderer in general they are. Now, I'm putting a little more focus on the character aspects because Ngaio Marsh focused more on character than plot, so I feel it's right to focus more on that for the purposes of this list. Not that Christie didn't focus on character, but Niall Marsh was always more character oriented than plot oriented. And fair warning, there are spoilers ahead. I'll start with a few honorable mentions. There aren't too many here. I mean, first up is Wolf Garcia from Artist in Crime, and he didn't make the list because it's not clear to me how culpable he was in the murder plot here. I also didn't put Bob Ledge from Death at the Bar, who has a pretty ingenious murder plot, but I just didn't find him that unique in the Niall Marsh canon. Giggle from Surfeit of Lampreys was in contention, and not only does he have the best name of a literary murderer, but he didn't make it because he's largely under control of Tinkerton. Connie Cardle from Hand in Glove didn't make it. She's one of those middle-aged spinster killers I love so much. And finally, the last honorable mention here is Montague Reese from Photo Finish, another dastardly figure with a genius plot, but again, I just found him less interesting than the ones who did make the list. And starting the list off at number 10 is a murderer I mentioned already, Tinkerton from Surfeit of Lampreys. And like I just said, Tinkerton is the mastermind of this duo with Giggle, and I love how they play into the Macbeth and Lady Macbeth dynamic, as well as Niall Marsh's love of Shakespeare, with the woman of the two being the mastermind, being the ruthless one, and the man essentially being a tool in her plans. It's Tinkerton who develops the murder plan, which she conveniently makes Giggle physically pull off, and it's a very clever plan, although a relatively simple one as well. She steals the skewer at a point that it clears Giggle. She then hands the skewer to Giggle and operates the elevator to make it look like Gabriel was murdered after the two had already descended the stairs. Tinkerton demonstrates a pretty ruthless persona here. I mean, she's in charge, and there's no doubt about it. And she plans this murder because Giggle is going to inherit land that she wants. There's apparently a romance between Giggle and Tinkerton that is very clearly one sided, as Tinkerton just simply wants the land and she has no issues of murdering Giggle and then framing her employer for it. And she does this the second he starts acting suspicious and thinks he's gonna give away the plot. I find Tinkerton oddly delightful and cruel, so I have her here at number 10. At number 9 is a murderer who probably belongs to the profession most likely to be a murderer in a mystery novel, and that is Dr. Daniel Davidson from Death in a White Tie. And Dr. Davidson is not only a murderer, he is also a blackmailer and the leader of the blackmailing ring, which Alan makes very clear he considers to be worse than murder. What Dr. Davidson has going for him is that he murdered Bunchy Gospel, who is the victim Alan is most upset over in any of his novel appearances. Dr. Davidson is able to pull off quite a brutal murder via suffocation using Bunchy's own cloak, and he does this in a taxi cab and is able to escape unseen. This is a tremendous risk, which I always appreciate in a murderer, and he's one of the smartest as well. He goes quite a bit of time without falling under suspicion, and he ran the blackmailing ring also for years, probably. And even the evidence against him isn't that strong, and I always laugh at the end when we find out he mailed Bunchy's cloak to China. He's very clever and also, a little funny as well, and comes in here at number 9. At number 8 is a late series murderer, and one of two, really, of as most of those who made the list are from their earlier novels. But here I have Bruce Gardner from Grave Mistake. And this is another aptly named killer, as Bruce is in fact a gardener. And I really loved his character. He comes off as this very affable guy. He's liked by both men and women, and he really seems genuine. The first time I read this book, I was totally sucked in. He didn't come across as two-faced, but then we would find out he not only murdered Sybil and also her stepson Claude. And this was betrayal of trust, as Sybil was more or less enamored with Bruce. He's a very crafty individual who manages to sneak around various places undetected. He's after this rare stamp and knows exactly where it is, and he is so easily able to infiltrate himself into Sybil's trust. It's actually remarkable how putty she is in his hands. Now, I will think this lie over why he took so long to dig Sybil's grave is one of the more avoidable and dumber mistakes a killer makes in an Allen novel, which is why I couldn't put Bruce any higher than here. But Bruce is such a devious and brilliant character nonetheless, so I have him at number 8. At number 7 is the very first killer in an Allen novel, Arthur Wilde from A Man Lay Dead. And initially, I didn't have Arthur Wilde on the list as he just seemed sort of like a generic killer. But when I really looked at him hard, there's a lot going on here under the surface. His main motive is greed. He does set to inherit, and this is cleverly obscured because Nigel is the main heir, while Arthur receives a smaller, though still valuable sum. And he is greedy, and he does come up with a somewhat clever murder plot, although it's not really the best. What made me put Arthur Wilde here at number seven is that his motive extended beyond greed. He was a man who simply had enough of Charles Rankin, who really made Wilde the butt of jokes and pranks for really all of his life and continuing on to middle age. I mean, just in the novel, Rankin humiliates Wilde, and that becomes the final straw. And yes, Wilde did need the money to cover his wife's death, but there was also that personal element that did it for me, so I put Wilde here at number seven. At number six is a murderer who got away with it for some time at least, and that is Douglas Grace from Dyed in the Wool. And Douglas Grace is probably one of the best examples of a murderer being an enemy agent. Sometimes these get, and really by any author, a little hammy and over the top, but Grace is well grounded. And what's so great about him is that he appears to be the hero of the story. He's the one who's actually working on the fuse for the Allied war effort, and there isn't this sense that he is a traitor. We never get any sense of why Douglas became a traitor, but it's highly implied he had some personal issues with Flossie, who was his aunt through marriage. And she was a very patriotic figure, so this may have actually been like something of like a rebellion against her. He disposes of her body in this really like disgusting manner of pushing it into the hay bundler, and she gets caught up in a bale of hay. And it's one of the more gruesome body discoveries in any mystery novel. And on top of that, Douglas is a very complex figure, this unsure young man who is sort of roguish, but also not really at the same time. He's very well portrayed as this man who is just unsure of himself and what he's going to do, and he's doing like so many men during the war were. And this is the sense about him that he's not really a bad guy at all, despite all of his like wicked and nefarious deeds. So I placed him at number six. At number five is a killer who always gives me the chills, and that is Felix Gardner, no relation to Bruce, from Enter a Murderer. And I've always loved the way Felix committed his murder by replacing the prop bullets with real bullets in the prop gun. He shoots Arthur Cerbona deer, but it looks like he was just set up. And Marsh uses this twist a few times, and this is such a devious example of it. There's so much sympathy for Felix, and you wouldn't think the solution would be so obvious as to be Felix, but it is. And I love how Felix's personality mimics that of his character in the play he's on. This upstanding gentleman who is actually a vicious personality. Felix's first murder is brilliant, nothing short of brilliant. And he only gets caught not because of that murder, but because he also has to murder the props master, and he gets caught doing that. Which, is a knock against him. But this first murder is so chilling to me. It reminds me a lot of the Alec Baldwin situation on Rust, which is not to make any suggestions or implications regarding that incident, but it is the mistake with the props master he made getting caught there, which makes me not put him any higher on the list than here at number five. At number four is another theatrical killer coming from the final Allen novel, Light Thickens, Gaston Sears. And this book is so well plotted and well told, and that extends to the murderer as well. Now, I don't think Gaston Sears is as well hidden as some of other Ngaio Marsh's killers, but he is a brilliant character. And we've seen other sorts of killers in his archetype from Marsh, but this is clearly the best example. He is so taken over by the power of the claymore. He is obsessed with it and its folklore. And there are other reasons why he kills McDougal, but this is the main one. The power of the claymore just takes over him. This is one of the most brutal murders in any mystery novel. You can argue it is the most brutal, but I think that goes to the murder committed by the killer I have at the top of this list. And it's gone over so many times in this book over how difficult it would be to pull off. Sears has to chop off McDougal's head, not make a mess, and then impale the head onto the claymore instead of the like fake prop one. It is so nasty and so graphic, and Marsh does not shy away from this at all. Sears is able to pull this off because he knows the production aspects of Macbeth so well. He's the battle director. He's also an actor in the production. I just find Gaston here such a fascinating personality and so well integrated into the story, and uses Marsh's love of Shakespeare, but is the fact that he's a bit obvious as a killer. Although, to be fair, he does get away with it for quite some time, and it actually takes one of Peregrine Jay's young children to figure it out, but still. From the reader's perspective, I did think this was a little bit obvious, so he comes in here at number 4. At number 3, we have the highest ranked man on the list, and that is Nicholas Compline from Death and the Dancing Footman. And Nicholas is another good example of the apparent victim really being the murderer. We see this so often, and it's kind of very predictable, even at this point in time. And Compline is one of the best users of that twist. He not only makes himself the apparent victim, but does it in such a way that he doesn't even appear to possibly have done it. Like, it doesn't even enter into anyone's mind. Is a natural that Nicholas Compline makes this list because of how deep into characters Marsh goes into this book, where everyone hates everyone. Nicholas, in particular, has a rocky relationship, probably the rockiest. He murders his brother William and is able to deceive so many people. He does that neat trick with the radio to make it look like William was still alive when he left the room. And Nicholas allows his mother to commit suicide for him and take the blame for this murder, which is really quite dastardly, if you ask me. And Nicholas's hatred for his brother is palpable, but it's not all consuming. It's essentially, in my opinion, portrayed as the right, proper amount of hatred, as to not be suspicious, but not to be, either way suspicious. And Nicholas is the most obvious suspect here, but he is able to easily fool everyone. He pushes Mandrake into the freezing pool, and I've always found this brilliant because Nicholas made eye contact with Mandrake. So when Mandrake is pushed, he can't possibly think Nicholas did it because the idea is that Mandrake was pushed by mistake. So Nicholas wouldn't do that because he knew it was Mandrake. It was such a clever little twist there. And Nicholas Compline might be the best Ngaio Marsh killer in terms of deception, but overall, when taken into characterization, he finishes here just short of the top at number 3. And at number 2, we have a personal favorite of mine, Miss Eleanor Prentice from Overture to Death. And I love a good middle aged spinster killer. We don't see them very often in Roderick Alleyn novels, but we do get it here in Overture to Death. And Miss Prentice is probably the killer I found most humorous. Her upright, repressive nature provided quite a bit of comic relief to me. Her fainting and pearl clutching at the idea of young people having sex is just so hilarious and is actually the catalyst that pushes her toward murdering Miss Campanella. And Miss Brent is a mean spirited caricature of Dorothy Sayers, but she's so over the top with her portrayal, just pearl clutching at what are pretty common practices now and even like semi common in the 1930s. And I think she probably has one of my favorite murder plots. I mean, rigging the gun into the piano, it's just so much fun to read. And it isn't that unbelievable as it sounds. I love the deception she pulls where she is the one who's supposed to play the piano, but she can't because her finger is infected. And she uses this to garner so much sympathy from the other characters, and even those who don't really like her. I think Overture to Death is full of great characters, with Miss Prentice being amongst the best, so she comes in here at number 2. At number 1, in the top spot, is probably the most ruthless murder in a mystery novel, really by any author, and that is Valmy Seacliff from Artist in Crime. And when I think of Valmy, I don't even think of the main murder of this book, that of Sonia the model, which is horrid in its own right. But I really think of the second murder in this book of Wolf Garcia, whom she murders by pouring hydrochloric acid down his throat. It is so brutal and so nasty. It is the perfect befitting plot of such a horrendous person. But let's also talk about Sonia's murder, whom Valmy essentially frames Wolf for. It is Wolf who put the knife under the model stand, but Valmy knows it's there, and she is the one who pushes it onto her. And Velma just gets sick over this, not because of her own guilt, but because the sound it made her just get sick. And it's so funny. And it's also, she deserves that as well. I mean, Velma combines several aspects of other murderers on this list. She garners the sympathy of her fellow students, and she essentially sets herself up. It looks like she was set up to murder Sonia by some other third party. And then we have all the character stuff going on with her besides the murders. She's a very vicious person, and she seduces Basil Pilgrim because he comes from a wealthy family, and that's all she wants out of him. We're told so many times that she enjoys causing pain to Sonia when she pushes her back into position, and she hates pretty much everyone in this book with a burning passion. And it's one of my favorite scenes from an Allen novel, but at the end of this book, when Inspector Allen asks Troy if she has any guesses as to who the murderer might be, and she says, well, it has to be Valmai because only Valmai is just horrible enough to commit two murders like this. And such a befitting description of her. And she's certainly the most evil murderer in an Allen novel. And in my opinion, the best murderer created by Ngaio Marsh and one of the best literary murderers of all time. So she comes in here at number one. And that is it for this video. Next week, I'm back to discussing Agatha Christie with Christie's 15 best victims. So stay tuned for that. And make sure you like this video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment below. Until next time, Mystery Files.